In the wilderness of Montana Territory, where winter winds cut through a man's soul as deep as his flesh, Eli Rembrandt raised his axe for the 1000th time. Each swing carved away more than bark and wood. It carved away the memory of pitying stares, the whispers about his twisted leg, the certainty that he would die alone. The half-built cabin stood as testament to his stubborn hope, logs fitted with the precision his carpenter father had taught him before consumption took him. When Clara Whitmore stepped down from that dusty stagecoach, her Boston refinement clashing with his Montana wilderness, neither expected the other to stay. She saw only a scarred, limping man in torn clothes. He saw only another woman who would leave. But when the blizzard trapped them together in those unfinished walls, something unexpected began to build between them, something stronger than timber, more lasting than stone. What happens when two broken souls discover that true strength isn't found in perfection, but in the courage to keep building despite the scars? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of sage-covered hills and pine-dark mountains that seemed to swallow a man's voice before it could travel 10 feet. Eli Rembrandt had chosen this isolation deliberately, trading the judgment of civilization for the honest brutality of wilderness. His homestead claim sat in a valley so remote that even the deer trails seemed hesitant to venture through. 3 years had passed since he'd limped away from the town of Sweetwater Creek, his left leg bearing the permanent reminder of a Confederate bullet that had found its mark at Antietam. The townspeople had been kind enough, he supposed, but kindness wrapped in pity felt worse than honest cruelty. The way their eyes would dart to his leg, then quickly away. The careful way they spoke, to him as if he might shatter like poorly fired pottery. The widows who brought him meals with that particular look that said they were doing their Christian duty, nothing more. His father, Samuel Rembrandt, had been a carpenter of uncommon skill. German stock, with hands that could coax beauty from the roughest pine and joints so tight they'd last 3 generations. Before the war, before the consumption took Samuel's breath away one autumn morning, he taught Eli everything he knew about wood and tools, and the patience required to build something meant to last. A man's character shows in his joints, son, Samuel would say, running his weathered fingers along a perfectly fitted corner. You can hide a lot behind paint and polish, but the bones of a thing tell the truth. The bones of Eli's cabin were telling the truth, all right. Each log had been selected with care, felled with his own hands, stripped with the patience his father had demanded. The foundation stones came from the creek bed, chosen for their shape and strength. Every mortise and tenon joint was cut by hand, fitted so precisely that gaps smaller than a knife blade were cause for starting over. The work was killing him slowly, and he was grateful for it. Each dawn brought the sweet ache of muscles pushed beyond their limits. Each sunset brought the satisfaction of another day's progress marked in timber and sweat. The cabin rose log by log, a testament to stubborn will and the memory of his father's teachings. The rusted axe that never left his side had belonged to Samuel. Its handle was smooth from 3 decades of use, stained dark with honest sweat and the oils of countless grips. The head still held its edge after all these years, though Eli sharpened it religiously each morning. The ritual as sacred as any, prayer. That axe had cleared the land for their old farmhouse, had built the workshop where Samuel had taught him the carpenter's trade, and now it was building this final refuge in the wilderness. Eli's Bible, its leather cover worn soft as cloth, sat on the rough-hewn table he'd finished just last week. The pages were yellowed and some were loose, but the words still carried weight. He read from it each night by candlelight, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of Ecclesiastes and Psalms. To everything there is a season, he would whisper. To the cabin walls, and a time to every purpose under heaven. His purpose, he'd decided, was solitude. Not the bitter kind that soured men's hearts, but the peaceful kind that came from accepting what couldn't be changed. He was 32 years old, scarred inside and out, with little to offer a woman beyond calloused hands and a limping gait. The mathematics were simple enough. Some men were meant for love and family, others for different kinds of building. The letter had been a moment of weakness, nothing more, written during a February blizzard when the loneliness sat heavier than usual, when the wind howled like all the children he'd never have. He'd seen the advertisement in an old newspaper someone had left at the trading post, refined Christian ladies seeking correspondence with gentlemen of good character, and something in him had broken open like ice in spring. He'd written 15 pages in his careful, deliberate script, pouring out thoughts he'd never spoken aloud, about the cabin and his dreams for it, about his father's teachings and the satisfaction of work done right, about the way morning mist rose from the creek and how the mountains changed color with the seasons, about loneliness that felt less like sadness and more like a permanent winter in his chest. Then he'd folded the letter, set it aside, and never sent it. What woman in her right mind would want a broken-down cowboy with more scars than prospects? The whole notion had been foolishness, the kind of wishful thinking that got men hurt. Except somehow, impossibly, the letter had found its way to the Whitmore Agency for Christian Correspondence in Boston. Mrs. Abernathy at the trading post, who handled mail for the scattered homesteaders, swore she'd never seen it. But letters had a way of getting mixed up, she said, with the kind of shrug that suggested stranger things had happened. Clara Whitmore had arrived on a Tuesday morning in early March, stepping down from the mail coach with the careful grace of a woman who'd spent her life managing long skirts and tight corsets. She was prettier than Eli had dared imagine. Auburn hair pinned beneath a traveling hat, green eyes that took in everything with quick intelligence, skin that had never known the touch of prairie wind or winter cold. She was also, it became immediately, apparent, horrified by what she found. Boston had taught Clara Whitmore many things: how to conduct herself with propriety, how to manage a classroom of unruly children, how to endure disappointment with dignity. It had not prepared her for Eli Rembrandt's homestead, which looked less like a future home, and more like an elaborate way to die of exposure. The cabin was half finished, its walls rising barely 7 feet from a foundation that seemed solid. Enough, but surrounded by stumps, wood shavings, and the general chaos of ongoing construction. There was no proper door, just a canvas tarp that flapped in the constant wind. No windows yet, just openings that would eventually hold glass if glass could be obtained and afforded. The roof was a patchwork of split cedar shingles and oiled canvas. Clearly a work in progress. Clara had grown up in a 3-story brownstone with gas lighting and indoor plumbing. Her father was a banker, her mother a fixture in Boston society. She'd taught at Miss Pemberton's Academy for Young Ladies until the unfortunate incident with Reverend Morrison, a misunderstanding involving private tutoring sessions and a few too many unchaperonated moments that had cost her both position and reputation. Though not, she maintained, her virtue. The broken engagement to Frederick Ashworth had been the final straw. Frederick, heir to a shipping fortune, had courted her with the enthusiasm of a man checking items off a list: respectable family, adequate dowry, pleasing appearance, suitable education. When the scandal broke, he'd withdrawn his proposal with the same mechanical precision, citing concerns about moral character and family reputation. Clara's parents, mortified by their daughter's fall from grace, had presented the mail-order bride opportunity as a solution. A fresh start in the territories, her mother had said, with the kind of forced brightness that suggested the alternative was worse. A chance to redeem yourself through honest Christian marriage. The letter from Eli Rembrandt had seemed promising enough. His writing showed education and thoughtfulness. His description of the Montana landscape held genuine poetry, and his obvious devotion to his late father suggested good character. Most importantly, he was 3,000 miles from Boston, and the whispers that followed her like smoke. But standing in the clearing beside his half-built cabin, watching him emerge from the woods with an armload of firewood and the careful gait of a man favoring an old injury, Clara felt the full weight of her mistake. This wasn't the new beginning she'd imagined, it was exile disguised as romance. Eli had stopped short when he saw her, the firewood tumbling from his arms as his face went through a series of emotions: surprise, hope, confusion, and finally, a kind of resigned disappointment that suggested he was already calculating the cost of her return journey. "Miss Whitmore, I presume," he'd said, his voice carrying the careful formality of a man who'd practiced the words. "I wasn't. That is, I didn't expect." "No," Clara had replied, looking around the clearing with undisguised dismay. "I can see that you didn't." They'd stood there in awkward silence, two people who'd imagined something entirely different when they'd pictured this moment. Clara saw a man whose shoulders were broader than she'd expected, whose brown eyes held depths of kindness despite his obvious discomfort. But she also saw the limp, the worn clothes, the primitive conditions that would be her life if she stayed. Eli saw a woman whose beauty made his chest ache, whose obvious refinement threw into sharp relief everything he lacked. He saw silk where he'd expected calico, education where he'd hoped for understanding, and in her green eyes a judgment he'd been running from his entire adult life. The mountains around them held their breath, waiting to see what two broken people would do when faced with the gap between hope and reality. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Clara's traveling dress, once pristine navy wool with mother-of-pearl buttons, now bore the dust of 3 days' journey across increasingly primitive roads. Her carefully arranged hair had begun to escape its pins, auburn strands catching the afternoon light as they framed her face. She clutched her leather satchel with both hands, knuckles white against the brown leather. Eli bent to gather the scattered firewood, his movements deliberate despite the obvious pain in his left leg. Each piece he collected gave him a moment's respite from her scrutiny, though he could feel her eyes cataloguing every detail. The patch on his shirt sleeve, the worn leather of his boots, the way he favored his right side when he straightened. "There's been some mistake," Clara said finally, her Boston accent crisp in the mountain air. "The letter I received spoke of an established homestead, a proper dwelling." She gestured toward the half-built cabin with one gloved hand. This is barely shelter." Heat rose in Eli's neck, the familiar burn of shame mixing with something sharper, disappointment so keen it felt like physical pain. "The letter shouldn't have been sent at all," he said quietly, straightening with the last piece of wood. "I never meant, that is, I wrote it, but never intended." "You never intended to send it." Clara's voice climbed higher, the careful control she'd maintained since Boston finally cracking. "You wrote to a matrimonial agency with no intention of following through?" "No, Mom. I mean, yes, I wrote it, but I never—" Eli stopped, running his free hand through hair that hadn't seen a proper barbering in months. "It's complicated." "Complicated," Clara repeated the word, as if it tasted bitter. "Mr. Rembrandt, I have traveled 3,000 miles based on correspondence that was apparently accidental. I have spent money I couldn't afford, burned bridges I cannot rebuild, and pinned my hopes on a future that exists only in your imagination." The words hit Eli like physical blows. He'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when his inadequacies would be laid bare by someone whose opinion mattered. He'd just hoped it might take longer than 5 minutes. "I can pay for your return journey," he said, though they both knew he couldn't. Not really. The money for timber and supplies had stretched thin, and winter had been longer than expected. "The mail coach comes through once a week, next Tuesday if the weather holds." Clara stared at him, and for a moment Eli thought he saw something flicker across her face. Hurt, maybe, or fear, but it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Once a week," she said slowly. "You're telling me I'm stranded here for 6, Days. The Hendersons have a place about 10 miles south. They might... Eli trailed off, knowing how that sounded. The Hendersons were good people, but their cabin was barely bigger than his, and taking in an unexpected guest for a week would strain their hospitality and their resources. I see. Clara looked around the clearing again, taking in the stumps, the piles of lumber, the canvas-covered supplies. And where exactly do you propose I sleep for these 6 days? There doesn't appear to be a proper door, let alone separate accommodations. The question hit Eli like a physical blow. In all his imagining of this moment, and he had imagined it, despite his better judgment, he'd somehow skipped past the practical realities. The cabin had 4 walls and most of a roof, but it was still very much a work in progress. His own bedroll was spread on the dirt floor in what would eventually be the main room. There was no privacy, no comfort, nothing approaching the accommodations a proper lady would expect. I could sleep outside, he offered, though the suggestion sounded weak even to his own ears. There's a lean-to where I keep the tools. Clara's laugh was sharp without humor. In March, in Montana, Mr. Rembrandt, I may be a displaced teacher from Boston, but I'm not completely naive about frontier life. She walked to the cabin's entrance, pushing aside the canvas tarp to peer inside. Eli watched her shoulders tense as she took in the sparse interior. Dirt floor swept clean, but still dirt. Rough-hewn furniture that would be generous to call rustic, and the general air of a space that served function over comfort. There's a proper floor planned, Eli said quickly. Pine boards, sanded smooth, and windows, real glass, not just shutters. The furniture's temporary, just until I can build something. Proper, planned, Clara repeated, not turning around. Yes, I can see the plans are quite ambitious. The wind picked up, setting the canvas tarp to snapping and sending wood shavings dancing across the clearing. The sound seemed to underscore the temporary nature of everything around them. The makeshift door, the unfinished walls, the fragile hope that had brought Clara here in the first place. When she turned back to face him, Clara's expression had shifted. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something else, a kind of weary resignation that made Eli's chest ache. "Mr. Rembrandt," she said, her voice carefully controlled again, "I think we both made mistakes. You wrote a letter you never intended to send, and I read more into it than was there. Perhaps it's best if we simply chalk it up to experience and move on with our lives." "Perhaps," Eli agreed, though the word came out rougher than he'd intended. He'd known this would happen, had told himself it was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier to watch his last hope for companionship walk away. Clara nodded briskly, as if settling a business transaction. "Then I'll impose on your hospitality. For the minimum time necessary, I'll sleep in the cabin, you can take the lean-to, and we'll simply endure until the mail coach returns." "You don't have to endure anything," Eli said, stung by the word. "I'm not asking you to stay." "No," Clara said quietly, "you're not." She turned back to the cabin, pulling the canvas aside again. This time she stepped inside, and Eli heard her moving around, the soft sounds of someone trying to make the best of an impossible situation. The first snowflakes began falling as the sun touched the western peaks, fat flakes that drifted down like ash from a distant fire. Eli looked up at the sky with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read weather the hard way. The clouds were thick and dark, the kind that meant serious snow, not just a passing squall. By the time full darkness fell, the wind had picked up to a steady howl, and the snow was coming down so hard Eli could barely see from the cabin to the lean-to. He'd spent the evening splitting wood by lamplight, trying to give Clara privacy while building up their fuel supply. Now, with the storm hitting in earnest, he realized they were facing something neither of them had planned for. "Miss Whitmore," he called through the canvas, raising his voice over the wind. "I need to come in. This is going to be a bad one." There was a pause, then Clara's voice, muffled by the tarp. "Come in." Eli pushed through the canvas, snow swirling in behind him before he could secure the opening. Clara stood near the rough stone fireplace he'd built along the far wall. her traveling dress exchanged for a simple grey wool skirt and white blouse. Her hair was down, falling in waves to her shoulders, and the sight of it made Eli forget for a moment why he'd come inside. "How bad?" she asked, nodding toward the storm. "Bad enough," Eli said, shaking snow from his coat. "Could be 3 days, maybe more. I've seen storms like this bury cabins." Clara was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information. "And your lean-to? Won't stand up to this kind of wind." Eli gestured toward the far corner of the cabin where he'd been sleeping. "I can make do with the floor by the fire. You can have the other corner." It was hardly an ideal arrangement for 2 strangers, but the alternative was freezing to death, and they both knew it. Clara nodded slowly, practical enough to recognize necessity when she saw it. "Very well," she said. "I suppose we'll have to make the best of it." Outside, the wind howled, like something alive and angry, rattling the canvas and sending snow through every gap in the unfinished walls. Inside, 2 people who'd expected something entirely different from this meeting settled into an uncomfortable détente, bound together by circumstances neither had chosen. The storm had trapped them, but it had also changed everything. What had been a brief, awkward interlude before Clara's departure was now an indefinite cohabitation with no clear end in sight. And in the close confines of the half-built cabin, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait, they would have to find a way to live together or drive each other mad in the attempt. As if reading his thoughts, Clara glanced at him across the small space, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "This is going to be interesting," she said quietly. Eli nodded, settling onto his bedroll with his back carefully turned to her corner. "Yes, ma'am, I suppose it is." The storm raged on, and their new life together, however temporary, began. The first morning brought an awkward dance of necessity and propriety. Clara woke to find Eli already gone, though she could hear the steady rhythm of his axe somewhere outside the cabin walls. The fire had burned low in the night, and the air inside held the sharp bite of mountain cold that made her breath visible in small puffs. She dressed quickly behind the blanket Eli had strung across one corner for her privacy, grateful for the small consideration even as she struggled with the buttons of her traveling dress. Her fingers were stiff with cold, and the simple task took twice as long as usual. Through the canvas door, she could see the storm had indeed been as fierce as Eli had predicted. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the clearing, transforming the landscape into something alien and white. When Eli returned with an armload of split wood, stamping snow from his boots at the threshold, he found Clara kneeling by the fireplace, coaxing flames from the banked coals with the careful precision of someone who'd never had to tend a fire, but was determined to learn. "Coffee's in the blue tin," he said quietly, nodding toward a rough shelf where his meager supplies were organized with military precision. "Sugar, too, if you take it." "Thank you." Clara didn't look up from the fire, but he heard genuine gratitude in her voice. "I'm afraid I'm not very accomplished at this. You're doing fine." Eli set the wood in a neat pile near the hearth, close enough to dry but far enough to be safe. "Fire's got its own personality. You just have to listen to what it's telling you." Clara glanced at him, then curious. "What is it telling you now?" Eli studied the flames for a moment, the way they licked at the fresh kindling, the color and height of them. That it's content, but not confident. Needs more substantial fuel to feel secure, but not so much that it gets smothered. He selected a piece of split pine, placing it carefully on the growing fire. "Like most living things, I suppose." The observation was more philosophical than Clara had expected from the quiet cowboy, and she found herself looking at him with new interest. There was intelligence in his weathered face, a thoughtfulness that his rough exterior had initially concealed. Their first shared meal was a quiet affair. Coffee that was stronger than anything Clara had ever tasted, along with biscuits Eli had made from a sourdough starter he kept in a covered jar. The biscuits were surprisingly good, light and tangy, though Clara couldn't help comparing them to the elaborate breakfasts her family's cook had prepared back in Boston. "How long have you been here?" she asked, wrapping her hands around the tin cup of coffee for warmth. 3 years, near enough. Came out after... Eli gestured vaguely toward his leg. "After the war ended and I got my discharge." "You fought for the Union?" "First Montana Infantry. Saw action at Antietam, Fredericksburg." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Clara caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Got this souvenir at Antietam." Another gesture toward his leg. Clara had heard enough war stories in Boston, drawing rooms, to recognize the careful way veterans spoke about their service, revealing just enough to satisfy curiosity while keeping the real memories locked away. That must have been difficult. War's difficult for everyone touched by it, Eli said simply. "I was luckier than most." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the cabin's green timbers settling. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside their small shelter felt surprisingly secure. As the day wore on, Clara began to notice things about Eli's approach to cabin building that spoke to both skill and artistry. The logs were fitted with a precision that would have impressed her father's banker friends, who prided themselves on attention to detail. Every joint was tight, every surface smoothed with obvious care. Even his tools, arranged on a makeshift workbench near the door, were maintained with the kind of devotion usually reserved for sacred objects. The wooden plane that sat in the place of honor among his tools was clearly old, its handle polished, smoothed by countless hours of use. When Clara asked about it, Eli's entire demeanor softened. "It was my father's," he said, picking up the tool with the reverence other men might reserve for family Bibles. "German-made. From before he came to America, he taught me everything I know about working wood. He was a carpenter, best in 3 counties. Pride warmed Eli's voice. Could make furniture that looked like it belonged in a palace, but he chose to build practical things instead. Houses that would stand for generations, barns that wouldn't fall down in the first strong wind. He said there was honor in building, things that mattered." Clara watched as Eli ran his thumb along the plane's blade, testing its edge with the unconscious expertise of long practice. "Is that what you're doing here, building something that matters?" The question seemed to catch Eli off guard. He was quiet for a long moment, still holding his father's plane, before answering. "Trying to, I suppose. This cabin, it's not much to look at now, but when it's finished, it'll stand for 100 years, maybe longer. Seems like that ought to count for something." As the second day passed, Clara found herself drawn into the rhythm of cabin life despite her initial reservations. There was something oddly satisfying about the simple tasks that filled their days. Keeping the fire fed, preparing meals from basic ingredients, maintaining their small space in the face of the storm's chaos outside. She discovered that Eli was surprisingly easy to live with. He moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, always mindful of her need for privacy, never presuming on their forced proximity. When she struggled with unfamiliar tasks, he offered guidance without making her feel incompetent. When she succeeded, coaxing a reluctant fire back to life, or preparing coffee that didn't taste like liquid tar, he offered genuine praise that warmed her more than the flames. On the third morning, Clara woke to find Eli already at work on something near the window opening. He was using his father's plane, creating long, curling shavings that fell like golden snow around his feet. The sound was rhythmic and peaceful, a counterpoint to the storm that still raged outside. "What are you making?" she asked, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders as she approached. "Window frames," Eli said without looking up from his work. "Storm's given me time to work on the details I usually put off. Figured I might as well make them proper." Clara watched his hands as he worked, scarred and calloused, but moving with surprising grace across the wood. The plane bit into the pine with each stroke, revealing the pale golden grain beneath the rough exterior. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father started teaching me when I was 8. Said idle hands were the devil's workshop. And the best. A way to keep a boy out of trouble was to put tools in his hands." A smile flickered across Eli's face. "Took me 3 months to make a simple box without cutting myself." He was patient, though. Never raised his voice, just kept showing me the right way until I got it. "He sounds like a good man." "The best." Eli paused in his work, looking out through the window opening at the swirling snow. He would have liked this place. The challenge of it. Building something from nothing, making it solid and true. Clara found herself studying Eli's profile as he spoke, noting the way his features softened when he talked about his father. There was a gentleness in him that she hadn't expected, a depth that contradicted her initial impression of a rough frontiersman. She began to understand that his silence wasn't rudeness, but thoughtfulness. His careful movements, not awkwardness, but consideration. "Will you teach me?" she asked impulsively. Eli turned to look at her, surprise clear on his face. "Teach you what?" "To use the plane, to work with wood." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the bold request. That is, in Boston, ladies don't typically—" "It's not women's work," Eli said quietly, but there was no judgment in his voice, only concern. "Takes strength, and the tools. Can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, but you could show me the basics, nothing complicated, just, I'd like to understand what you're doing, how you make something beautiful from something rough." Eli studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was serious. Whatever he saw, there seemed to convince him, because he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, setting down the plane and moving to select a piece of scrap wood from his supply. "We'll start simple, just learning to feel the grain, understanding how the wood wants to be worked." He positioned Clara's hands on a smaller plane he kept for detail work, his fingers warm and steady as they guided hers. "The secret is patience," he said, his voice low and close to her ear. "Let the tool do the work. Don't force it." Clara's first attempts were clumsy, the plane skipping and gouging instead of cutting smooth shavings. But Eli was patient, just as his father had been, showing her again and again, until she began to feel the rhythm of it. When she finally managed, a clean, even stroke that produced a perfect curl of wood, her face lit up with triumph. "There," Eli said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Now you're listening to what the wood's telling you." As the storm continued to rage outside, Clara and Eli found themselves settling into an unexpected partnership. The work gave them something to focus on besides the awkwardness of their situation, and Clara discovered she had more aptitude for it than either of them had expected. Her hands might be soft and unused to hard labor, but they were steady and precise, qualities that served her well in the detailed work of smoothing and fitting. By the time the wind finally began to die down on the 4th day, Clara had helped Eli complete not just the window frames, but several other small projects that had been waiting for attention. The cabin felt more finished, more like a real home, and less like a temporary shelter. More importantly, the two strangers who had been trapped together by circumstance were beginning to see each other as individuals rather than disappointments. Clara was discovering that there was far more to Eli Rembrandt than his scarred exterior suggested, while Eli was learning that Boston refinement didn't necessarily mean Boston fragility. The storm was ending, but something else was just beginning. The morning after the storm broke, Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the window openings for the first time since her arrival. The quality of light was different here than in Boston. Sharper, cleaner, with a crystalline clarity that made everything seem more vivid. Snow sparkled like scattered diamonds across the clearing, and the mountains beyond rose into a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Eli was already up, as seemed to be his habit, but instead of working outside, he sat at the rough table with what appeared to be a book propped open before him. Clara watched him for a moment before she realized what she was seeing. He was reading, or trying to, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the words with obvious concentration. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Eli looked up, color rising in his cheeks as he realized he'd been observed. "Morning. Storm's moved on. Should be able to dig out today." Clara moved closer, curiosity overcoming propriety. The book was a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress, its pages yellowed with age and handling. Eli's finger marked his place beneath a paragraph he'd apparently been struggling with. "Bunyan can be challenging," she observed gently. "All those allegories and archaic phrases can read well enough for most things," Eli said, defensive pride creeping into his voice. "But some books, the words are different, fancier. Would you like help?" The offer came out before Clara could think better of it. "I mean, if you'd like. I taught reading for several years." Eli studied her face, looking for signs of condescension or pity. Finding neither, he nodded slowly. "Might be. That would be kind of you." Clara fetched her own small slate from her traveling bag, a habit from her teaching days. "May I see where you're reading?" Eli pointed to the passage that had been giving him trouble. Something about Christian's burden and the difficulty of his journey. Clara read it aloud first, her clear voice giving proper emphasis to Bunyan's rhythms, then broke it down into simpler terms. "Bunyan uses many symbols," she explained, settling beside Eli at the table. "When he writes about Christian carrying a burden, he means the weight of sin and guilt that all people carry. The difficult journey represents the challenges of living a faithful life, like building a cabin," Eli said slowly, understanding dawning in his brown eyes. "One log at a time, and some days the load feels heavier than others." "Exactly." Clara smiled, pleased by his insight. "You understand it perfectly. You just needed the key to unlock the language." They spent the morning working through several pages together, Clara patiently explaining unfamiliar words and concepts, while Eli absorbed the lessons with the same focused attention he brought to his woodworking. She discovered that his reading difficulties stemmed not from lack of intelligence, but from limited education. Schooling had been interrupted by farm work, then war, then the necessity of making a living with his hands. "Your handwriting is beautiful," Clara observed when Eli wrote out some of the new words for practice. "Someone taught you proper penmanship." "My mother," Eli said, the same softness entering his voice that appeared whenever he spoke of his parents. "She was a school teacher before she married my father, made sure I learned to write properly, even if there wasn't time for much else. She would be proud of your progress. She died when I was 16. Fever took her." Eli's voice carried old grief, but also acceptance. "But yes, I think she would be pleased." As the day progressed, their roles began to reverse. Clara had helped Eli with his reading, and now he set about teaching her practical skills she'd never needed in Boston, but would be essential anywhere beyond city limits. He showed her how to bank a fire properly so it would last through the night, how to tell when water was truly boiling versus just steaming, how to read the sky for signs of changing weather. "City folk think the frontier is all about strength and shooting," Eli said, as he demonstrated the proper way to split kindling. "But mostly it's about paying attention, understanding what things are telling you. What is the sky telling you now?" Clara asked, looking up at the clear blue expanse. "That we've got maybe 2 days of good weather before the next system moves in. Enough time to get some outdoor work done, but not enough to get careless." Clara found herself fascinated by this. Different kind of intelligence, not the book learning she'd always valued, but a deep understanding of the natural world and how to live within its rhythms. Eli read wind patterns the way she read literature, finding meaning in subtle signs most people would miss entirely. Their cooking arrangements began to evolve as well. Clara's attempts at frontier cuisine were initially disastrous. Burned biscuits, coffee that could strip paint, stew that somehow managed to be both oversalted and flavorless. But Eli was patient, showing her how to gauge heat by holding her hand over the coals, how to season by smell and taste rather than measurement, how to time things so everything finished together. Cooking's like carpentry, he explained, as Clara stirred a pot of beans that actually smelled edible. You start with good materials, use the right techniques, and pay attention to what's happening. Can't rush it, can't ignore it, but if you're patient and careful, you get something worthwhile. Is that your philosophy for everything? Clara asked, genuinely curious. Eli considered the question seriously. I suppose it is. Never saw much point in doing things halfway or in a hurry. If something's worth doing, it's worth doing right. As evening approached, they fell into what was becoming their routine. Eli, working by lamplight on some aspect of the cabin, while Clara read aloud from one of the few books she'd brought. Tonight it was Tennyson, the measured cadences of In Memoriam filling the cabin with beauty that seemed almost tangible. Strong Son of God, immortal love, Clara read, her voice giving full weight to the poet's grief and faith, whom we, that have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone, embrace, believing where we cannot prove. Eli's hands stilled on the piece he was smoothing, listening with complete attention. When Clara finished the stanza, he was quiet for a long moment. Read that last part again, he said softly. Believing where we cannot prove? Yes. Eli resumed his work, but his movements were more thoughtful now. That's what building this cabin feels like sometimes, believing it'll amount to something when all I can see is logs and gaps and work still to be done. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that surprised her. That's what leaving Boston felt like. Believing there was something better out here, even though I couldn't prove it. Their eyes met across the small space, and for a moment the gap between their different worlds seemed less insurmountable. They were both, she realized, engaged in acts of faith, building toward futures they could envision but not guarantee. Tell me about your teaching, Eli said, settling into his chair with obvious interest. What was it like, working with children? Clara's face lit up as she described her classroom at Miss Pemberton's academy. The eager faces of young girls, hungry for knowledge, the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in a student's eyes, the way literature could transport people beyond the confines of their immediate circumstances. I loved watching them discover that words had power, she said, animated in a way Eli hadn't seen before, that they could travel to different worlds through books, could understand people and places they'd never encounter otherwise. Is that what you miss most, the teaching? Clara considered this carefully. I miss the purpose of it, feeling like I was doing something that mattered, that made a difference in people's lives. But you are, Eli said simply. You're teaching me, making a difference right here. The observation caught Clara off guard. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost, her position, her reputation, her planned future, that she hadn't considered what she might be gaining. Here in this half-built cabin, sharing knowledge with a man who valued learning despite his rough exterior, she was still teaching, still making a difference. I suppose I am, she said softly, surprised by how much the realization pleased her. As they prepared for sleep that night, the easy intimacy of their shared routine struck Clara as remarkable. Somehow, in just a few days, they developed the comfortable rhythms of people who'd lived together for years. Eli banked the fire while Clara arranged her sleeping area, each respecting the other's need for privacy while working together to maintain their shared space. Clara, Eli said quietly as she settled onto her makeshift bed. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. Yes, thank you. For the reading lessons, for all of it. Thank you for the other lessons, for letting me help with the cabin work. You're good at it, got a feel for the wood. Clara smiled in the darkness. I had a good teacher. Outside, the night was still and clear, stars brilliant in the thin mountain air. Inside the cabin, two people who'd expected disappointment were discovering something neither had dared to hope for. The possibility that sometimes the best things came from the most unexpected places. But even as understanding grew between them, Both Clara and Eli knew that questions remained unanswered. The storm had given them time to get to know each other, but it had also postponed the moment when Clara would have to decide whether to stay or return to Boston. And that decision, with all its implications for both their futures, was drawing closer with each passing day. The days following the storm settled into a rhythm that surprised Clara with its contentment. She woke each morning to the sound of Eli's axe ringing against wood, a steady percussion that had become as familiar as a heartbeat. By the time she dressed and emerged from behind her privacy curtain, he would have the fire built up and coffee brewing, moving through these morning tasks with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. But it was no longer solitude, and they were both acutely aware of the change. Clara found herself anticipating their shared meals, the conversations that had grown easier and more natural with each passing day. Eli was a thoughtful listener, asking questions about her life in Boston that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. In return, she drew stories from him about his childhood, his father's workshop, the satisfaction of creating something lasting with his own hands. "Show me how to make coffee properly," Clara said one morning, tired of the bitter brew that resulted from her inexperienced attempts. Eli moved to stand beside her at the small cooking area he'd arranged near the fireplace. "It's about the timing," he said, his voice carrying the same patient tone he used when teaching her to work with wood. "And the proportions. Too much, and it's strong enough to float a horseshoe. Too little, and it tastes like muddy water." He guided her hands as she measured the grounds, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. Clara found herself acutely aware of his nearness, the scent of pine sap and honest work that clung to his clothes, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his brown eyes focused with complete attention on the task at hand. "Like this?" she asked, though she was more conscious of the way his sleeve brushed against her arm than of the coffee grounds in her palm. "Perfect." Eli's voice was softer than usual, and when Clara glanced up, she found him looking at her face rather than the coffee. For a moment, they stood frozen in the small space between them, awareness crackling like the fire behind them. Then Eli stepped back, clearing his throat. "That should brew up just right." The coffee did indeed taste better, but Clara found herself remembering the moment of closeness more than the improved flavor. Something was shifting between them, an awareness that had nothing to do with their practical partnership and everything to do with the way Eli's smile transformed his weathered features, or the way Clara's laugh seemed to light up the cabin's dim interior. As the week progressed, their domestic arrangements became more sophisticated. Clara discovered a talent for organization that served them well in the cabin's limited space, finding ways to arrange Eli's tools and supplies for maximum efficiency. Eli, in turn, began small projects specifically designed to make Clara's stay more comfortable. A proper washstand with a basin and pitcher, hooks for hanging clothes, a small mirror positioned to catch the morning light. The most significant addition was a wooden spoon he carved during the long evening hours, while Clara read aloud. She watched the project progress night by night, rough wood gradually becoming smooth and graceful under his patient knife. The handle was perfectly sized for a woman's hand, the bowl shaped with mathematical precision to hold just the right amount. "It's beautiful," Clara said when Eli finally presented it to her, running her fingers over wood so smooth it felt like silk. "I've never owned anything made specifically for me. Just a spoon," Eli said, but pleasure at her reaction warmed his voice. "No," Clara said seriously, "it's much more than that." She was right, and they both knew it. The spoon represented care, attention, the desire to create something beautiful for someone else's pleasure. It was a courtship gift disguised as practicality, and its significance was not lost on either of them. Their evening routines evolved as well. After the day's work was done and supper cleaned away, they would settle by the fire. Clara with her mending or one of her books, Eli with whatever small project occupied his hands. Sometimes Clara read aloud, her clear voice filling the cabin with poetry or passages from her small collection of novels. Other times they simply talked, sharing memories and observations with the easy intimacy of people who'd found unexpected companionship. "Tell me about your students," Eli said one evening as he worked on sanding a piece that would become part of a proper bed frame. "What were they like?" Clara smiled, setting aside the shirt she was mending. "Eager, mostly. Full of questions about everything. There was one girl, Margaret Ashworth. She was the youngest in my class, but always the first to finish her lessons. She would devour books like other children devour sweets." "Ashworth," Eli repeated, glancing up from his work. "Any relation to that Frederick fellow you mentioned?" "His youngest sister." Clara's expression grew more guarded. "She was one of my brightest students. I often wonder what became of her after I had to leave." Eli heard the pain in her voice and set down his sandpaper. "What really happened in Boston, Clara? You don't have to tell me if you'd rather not, but it seems like there's more to the story than a simple misunderstanding." Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it might provide the words she needed. Finally, she spoke. "I was giving private tutoring sessions to some of the older students. Extra lessons in literature and composition for those who wanted to advance their learning beyond the standard curriculum. It was all perfectly proper. We met in the school library, with the door open during regular hours." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But Reverend Morrison began attending these sessions, ostensibly to ensure religious principles were being upheld in the education. He was attentive, too attentive. He would stay after the students left, asking questions about my methods, complimenting my knowledge." Eli's jaw tightened, beginning to understand. "One afternoon he made advances, improper ones. I refused, of course, and asked him to leave. But the next week stories began circulating about inappropriate behavior in my classroom. Suggestions that I had encouraged the Reverend's attention, that my private lessons were covers for unseemly meetings. And people believed him over you? He's a man of God with a sterling reputation," Clara said bitterly. "I'm an unmarried woman with no family connections powerful enough to contradict his word. The school had no choice but to dismiss me to protect their reputation. And Frederick? Frederick believed the rumors, or chose to believe them because they gave him an excuse to break our engagement without appearing cruel." Clara's voice was steady now, the pain tempered by time and distance. "His family never approved of the match anyway. I wasn't quite wealthy enough, quite connected enough for their aspirations." Eli was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the injustice of it. When he spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed anger. "Men like that, they take what they want and blame others for the consequences. You deserved better, perhaps. But dwelling on it doesn't change anything. I made my choice to come west, to start over. Whatever happens now, at least it's my decision." The conversation had revealed another layer of Clara's strength. Not just her intelligence and adaptability, but her resilience in the face of betrayal and loss. Eli found himself admiring her even more, while also feeling a fierce protectiveness toward this woman who'd been so badly treated by people who should have protected her. As March drew toward its close, their shared work on the cabin progressed beyond mere survival maintenance. Clara had become genuinely skilled with the smaller tools, able to sand and fit pieces with increasing precision. Eli trusted her with more complex tasks, and she took pride in contributing meaningfully to the construction. "Hand me that board," Eli called from where he was working on the window frame. "The one you finished yesterday." Clara retrieved the piece she'd spent hours sanding to perfect smoothness. It fit into the frame exactly as planned, the joints tight and true. "Look at that," Eli said with genuine admiration. "Couldn't have done it better myself." The praise warmed Clara more than she cared to admit. In Boston, her accomplishments had been largely intellectual. Lesson plans executed well. Students who performed admirably on examinations. Here, her contributions were immediately visible, permanently part of something that would stand for generations. But as their partnership deepened and their mutual attraction became harder to ignore, both, Clara and Eli, found themselves confronting questions they'd been avoiding. Clara's original plan to return to Boston seemed increasingly remote, but what exactly was the alternative? Eli had never formally proposed marriage, and Clara wasn't sure what she wanted, even if he did. The physical awareness between them grew, stronger each day. When Eli helped Clara reach something from a high shelf, their bodies would brush together in ways that left both of them breathless. When Clara bandaged a cut on Eli's hand from a wayward chisel, her gentle touch lingered, longer than strictly necessary. They were two healthy adults living in close quarters, discovering they genuinely enjoyed each other's company, and the natural progression of such circumstances was becoming harder to resist. Yet both held back, each afraid of presuming too much, of risking the fragile harmony they'd built. Clara wasn't sure she was ready to trust another man with her heart, especially one whose life was so different from everything she'd known. Eli couldn't quite believe that an educated, refined woman like Clara would choose him over the comfortable possibilities that awaited her back east. The tension came to a head one evening when Clara was helping Eli fit a particularly challenging joint. They were both on their knees, working by lamplight to align the pieces perfectly. When the joint finally slipped into place with satisfying precision, they both looked up at the same moment, their faces inches apart. The attraction that had been building for days crystallized in that instant. Eli's eyes dropped to Clara's lips, and she felt her breath catch. For a heartbeat, they balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. Then Clara pulled back, her cheeks flushed. It's getting late." "Yes," Eli agreed, though his voice was rough. "Yes, it is." They finished their work in careful silence, each acutely aware of what had almost happened. As they prepared for sleep, the cabin felt charged with unspoken possibilities, both exciting and terrifying. Neither of them slept easily that night, lying awake in their separate corners while the fire burned low and the walls of the cabin seemed to pulse with the rhythm of two hearts beating just slightly out of sync. The morning after their near kiss dawned grey and uncertain, with clouds building over the mountains like gathered doubts. Clara woke to find Eli already gone, though she could hear him working somewhere behind the cabin with unusual intensity. The rhythm of his axe was faster than normal, more aggressive, as if he were trying to work through some internal struggle with brute force. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find him splitting logs with a ferocity that spoke of frustration. His shirt was already damp with sweat despite the cool morning air, and she could see the tension in every line of his body. "Eli," she called softly. He paused mid-swing, not turning around. "Morning. Coffee's ready inside." There was a careful distance in his voice that hadn't been there for days, and Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. The easy intimacy they'd built was gone, replaced by the awkward formality of their first meeting. "Are you all right?" she asked, moving closer despite his obvious desire for space. "Fine." Eli set down the axe and finally faced her, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. "Just thought I'd get an early start on the woodpile. Going to need plenty of fuel if—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. "If what?" Clara wanted to ask, but the set of his shoulders warned her off. Instead, she nodded and retreated to the cabin, where she sat alone with her coffee and tried to understand what had changed between last night and this morning. Their breakfast was a stilted affair, marked by careful politeness and topics that skirted dangerously close to silence. Eli focused intently on his food, as if it required his complete attention. Clara found herself chattering about inconsequential things: the weather, the progress of the cabin, anything to fill the uncomfortable. "Quiet. The mail coach should be able to get through by next week," Eli said finally, his words dropping into the conversation like stones into still water. Clara's hand stilled on her coffee cup. "Oh. Yes, I suppose it should. You'll want to send word." To your family. Let them know your plans. The carefully neutral way he said it made Clara's chest tighten. He was giving her an escape, she realized. Last night's almost intimacy had frightened him, and now he was retreating behind the safe assumption that she would leave. "What if my plans aren't settled yet?" she asked quietly. Eli glanced up then, surprise flickering across his features before the careful mask returned. "I suppose that's your decision to make. Is it? Or have you already made it for me?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Eli's jaw worked, as if he were chewing on words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. "Clara," he said finally, her name rough in his throat. "You're educated, refined. You've got family back east, opportunities I can't give you. He gestured around the cabin, "this isn't the life you were meant for. Don't you think I should be the judge of what kind of life I'm meant for? Maybe, but I won't be the reason you throw away everything you've worked for." Clara set down her cup with more force than necessary. "Everything I've worked for? Eli, I lost my position, my reputation, my engagement. The life I had in Boston is gone. Coming here wasn't throwing anything away. It was trying to build something new. With me." The words came out broken, vulnerable in a way that revealed the heart of his fear. "Clara, look at me. Really look. I'm a broken-down cowboy with a gimpy leg and no prospects beyond this half-built cabin. You deserve better than—" "Stop!" Clara's voice cut through his self-deprecation like a blade. "Don't you dare tell me what I deserve. And don't you dare make decisions about my life based on your own fears." Eli flinched as if she'd struck him. "My fears." "Yes, your fears. You're terrified that if you let yourself hope for something good, it'll be taken away. So you're pushing me away before I can leave on my own." The accuracy of her observation hit Eli like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "I need to get back to work." "Eli." "Wait," but he was already gone, leaving. Clara alone, with the echo of words that had cut too close to the bone. The rest of the day passed in a strained pantomime of their previous harmony. They worked on separate projects, spoke only when necessary, and carefully avoided the kind of casual contact that had become natural between them. The cabin felt smaller somehow, charged with unspoken tension that made the air itself seem harder to breathe. That evening, Clara sat by the fire with her mending while Eli worked at his bench in stubborn silence. The quiet that had once felt, comfortable now, pressed against them like a physical weight. Finally, Clara set aside her needle and thread. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with quiet determination. Eli's hand stilled on the piece. He was smoothing, but he didn't look up. "When Frederick broke our engagement," Clara continued, "I thought it was because I wasn't good enough, not wealthy enough, not connected enough, not perfect enough to be the wife he wanted. I spent months believing that if I'd just been better, somehow he wouldn't have abandoned me." She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. "But I was wrong. Frederick didn't leave because I wasn't good enough. He left because he was a coward who valued his family's approval more than his promises to me, just like you're doing now." That got Eli's attention. His head snapped up, eyes flashing with hurt and anger. "That's not, isn't it?" Clara's voice remained steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "You're so convinced that I'll leave you eventually, that you're making it inevitable. You're pushing me away to protect yourself from the possibility of being hurt, just like Frederick chose his family's comfort over the risk of standing by me." Eli stood slowly, his face pale. "That's not fair, Clara." "No, it's not fair, but it's true." She rose to face him across the small space that felt like a chasm. "I came here thinking I was running away from a broken life. But maybe I was running towards something instead. Maybe I was meant to find this place, this life. You." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and Eli's carefully constructed defenses cracked. "Clara, I know you're scared," she whispered. "I'm scared too, but I'm more scared of walking away from something real because it's not what I planned." They stood there in the flickering firelight, Two people balanced on the edge of honesty. The cabin around them held its breath, waiting to see which way they would fall. "I'm not good enough for you," Eli said finally, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I'm not educated like you. I can't give you the kind of life you grew up with. All I have is this cabin and these hands and the hope that maybe I can build something that matters." "You are building something that matters," Clara said softly. "Can't you see that? This cabin, yes, but more than that. You're building a life based on honesty and hard work and kindness. That matters more than all the fine houses and society connections in Boston." She took a step toward him, then another, until they were close enough to touch. "Eli, in the past weeks, I felt more like myself than I have in years. Not the woman my parents wanted me to be, or the wife Frederick expected, but who I really am. That's what you've given me. That's what we've built together." Eli's resolve wavered as he looked down into her upturned face, seeing the truth of her words written in her green eyes. "But your family, your education, will still be there if I choose to claim them. But this," she gestured between them, "this might not be. If I get on that mail coach next week, if I go back to Boston and try to rebuild the life I had, I'll spend the rest of my days wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay. And if you stay, if this doesn't work out the way we hope," Clara smiled then, sad and brave and beautiful, "then at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll know I didn't run away from the possibility of love because I was too afraid to reach for it." The word hung between them. Love. Neither had spoken it before, though it had been growing in the spaces between their words for days. Now it was there in the open, fragile and precious and terrifying. "Clara," Eli breathed, reaching up to touch her face with fingers that trembled slightly. "I don't know how to be what you need." "Just be yourself," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "That's all I've ever wanted." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate hunger of a man who'd been starving without knowing it. Clara responded with equal intensity, pouring all her hope and fear and growing love into the connection between them. They broke apart only when breathing became necessary, foreheads pressed together as they tried to process what had just changed between them. "I love you," Eli said simply, the words he'd been afraid to speak finally finding their way into the world. "I love you too," Clara replied, and the truth of it rang through the cabin like a bell. They held each other in the firelight, two people who'd found something neither had dared to hope for. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the canvas, and reminding them that storms still came and winter still threatened. But inside their small sanctuary, wrapped in each other's arms, they felt strong enough to weather whatever might come. The wedding ring from Clara's broken engagement sat forgotten in the bottom of her traveling bag, a symbol of promises that had proved hollow. What she and Eli were building had no need for symbols. It was real and growing and rooted in the solid foundation of honest work and mutual respect. But even as they held each other close, both knew that declaring their love was only the beginning. They still had to decide what form their future would take, still had to navigate the practical realities of building a life together. And somewhere in the back of both their minds, the knowledge lingered that the mail coach would come next week, bringing with it the final test of their newfound commitment. For now, though, it was enough to hold each other in the flickering light of their small fire, feeling the solid walls of the cabin around them like an embrace, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning brought more than just sunlight through the cabin's windows. It brought the distant sound of wheels and harnesses that made Clara's heart leap with unexpected panic. She and Eli had spent the night in each other's arms, not as lovers, but as two people finally honest about their feelings, holding each other close while they talked until dawn about their hopes and fears for the future. Now, barely an hour after sunrise, reality was approaching in the form of a mail coach struggling through the muddy roads that spring thaw had left treacherous but passable. "That's Tom Fletcher's rig," Eli said, standing in the doorway with his hand shading his eyes. "He's early, Wasn't expecting him for another 3 days at least. Clara joined him at the threshold, her stomach clenching as she watched the familiar coach navigate the final turn into their valley. Why would he come early? Must have mail that can't wait, or passengers with urgent business. Eli's voice was carefully neutral, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. They'd confessed their love just hours ago, but the practical questions remained unanswered. Now those questions were approaching at the speed of 4 horses and creaking wheels. The coach pulled to a stop in the clearing, with a spray of mud and the snorting of winded animals. Tom Fletcher, a weathered man of 60 with kind eyes and a perpetual chew of tobacco, climbed down from the driver's seat with obvious stiffness. "Morning, Eli," he called, spitting brown juice into the mud. "Miss Whitmore, got some mail here that couldn't wait for regular delivery." He reached into a leather satchel and withdrew a thick envelope bearing an official-looking seal. "Came through the territorial office in Helena, marked urgent." Clara accepted the envelope with trembling fingers, recognizing the elaborate script of her father's hand. The weight of it suggested multiple pages, never a good sign in her family's correspondence. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher," she managed. Do you need an immediate reply?" Tom glanced between Clara and Eli, his experienced eyes taking in the subtle changes in their demeanor, the way they stood closer together, the protective angle of Eli's body toward Clara, the unmistakable signs of 2 people who'd found something worth fighting for. "Well now," he said slowly, "I was planning to head back to Sweetwater Creek this afternoon, maybe stay overnight at the Henderson place. Could wait until tomorrow morning if you need time to think on your response." "That would be kind," Clara said, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. After Tom had unhitched his horses and accepted Eli's offer of the lean-to for shelter, Clara and Eli retreated to the cabin. The envelope sat on the rough table between them like an unexploded charge, its very presence changing the atmosphere of their small sanctuary. "Aren't you going to open it?" Eli asked quietly. Clara stared at the envelope, as if it might reveal its contents through sheer force of will. "I'm afraid to. My father only writes urgent letters when something terrible has happened or when he's made a decision that will affect my entire future. Maybe it's good news. My family doesn't send." "Good news by urgent courier, Eli." Clara's laugh was hollow. "Good news can wait for regular mail." With fingers that shook slightly, she broke the wax seal and unfolded several sheets of expensive stationery. Her father's precise handwriting covered both sides of each page in the cramped style of a man who never wasted words or paper. As Clara read, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, and finally something that looked like nausea. When she reached the end, she set the pages down carefully and stared at the wall, as if seeing something far beyond the cabin's log construction. "Clara?" Eli's voice was gentle but concerned. "What is it?" "Frederick is dead," she said simply. Eli felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "Dead? How?" "Carriage accident 3 weeks ago. He was traveling to New York on business when his driver lost control on an icy road." Clara's voice was oddly flat, as if she were reading from a newspaper rather than discussing someone she'd once planned to marry. "They found his body in the river 2 days later. Clara, I'm sorry. I know you. Even though things ended badly between you, this must be... There's more." Clara picked up the letter again, her hands steadier now. "It seems Frederick never told his family about breaking our engagement. As far as they knew, we were still planning to marry in June. When news of his death reached them, they naturally assumed I was his grieving fiancé." Eli frowned, beginning to understand. "What did they do?" "They've settled his inheritance on me." Clara's voice carried a note of disbelief. "All of it? The shipping business, the house in Boston, investments worth more than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. Frederick's will apparently named me as his sole beneficiary, written back when we were engaged and never changed." The words fell into the cabin like stones into deep water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. Eli felt the bottom drop out of his stomach as the full meaning became clear. "You're rich," he said quietly. Very rich. Obscenely rich. According to my father's calculations. Clara looked up at Eli, her green eyes reflecting a mixture of shock and something that might have been fear. My father writes that the Ashworth family is eager to welcome me into their fold, and that they've already begun planning a memorial service where I would be honored as Frederick's intended bride. And your family? Ecstatic. My mother has apparently already begun planning my return to Boston, convinced that this inheritance will restore not just my financial security, but my social standing. The scandal of the broken engagement is forgotten now that I'm Frederick's wealthy widow-in-waiting. Clara stood abruptly, walking to the window opening to stare out at the mountains. They want me to return immediately. The Ashworth lawyers need to meet with me to transfer the properties, and there are social obligations that apparently can't wait. Eli felt something cold spreading through his chest. The mathematics were brutally simple. Clara could return to Boston as one of the wealthiest unmarried women in the city, with enough money to live in luxury for the rest of her life, or she could stay in Montana as the wife of a dirt-poor cowboy whose greatest asset was a half-built cabin. You have to. Go, he said, the words scraping his throat raw. Do I? Clara turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Clara, this is everything you lost when you came here. Your reputation, your security, your place in society, it's all being handed back to you. Is that what you think I want? The question hung between them, loaded with the weight of everything they'd discovered about each other over the past weeks. Eli looked at Clara's face, searching for signs of the excitement or relief he expected to see. Instead, he found something that looked like anguish. I think, he said carefully, that you'd be a fool not to take it. Would I? Would I be a fool to choose money over love? Security over happiness? You don't know that you'd be happy here, Eli said, his voice rough with the effort of saying words that felt like they were tearing something inside him. This is hard country, Clara. Harsh winters, isolation, back-breaking work just to survive. You've had a taste of it these past weeks. But that was temporary. A lifetime of it. That's different. Don't. Clara's voice was sharp. Don't do that. Don't make this decision for me by painting everything here as misery and everything in Boston as paradise. That's not honest, and we both know it. But it's practical. Eli shot back. Clara, I love you. God help me, I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life. But I won't be the reason you throw away a fortune and a chance at the kind of life you deserve. The kind of life I deserve? Clara's eyes flashed with anger. According to whom? According to you. According to my parents. According to society's expectations about what a woman should want. She moved closer to him, her voice rising with emotion. What if what I deserve is the right to choose my own life? What if what I deserve is a man who loves me for who I am, not what I can bring to a marriage? What if what I deserve is the chance to build something real with my own hands instead of living off dead Frederick's money? It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple. Clara's voice cracked with the force of her conviction. The only thing that complicates it is fear. My fear of giving up security for love, and your fear that you're not worth the sacrifice. Eli flinched as if she'd struck him. Maybe I'm not. And maybe, Clara said quietly, all the fight going out of her voice. That's what this is really about. Maybe you're using this inheritance as an excuse to push me away because you still don't believe you deserve to be loved. The accusation hit too close to home, and Eli turned away from her penetrating gaze. Outside, Tom Fletcher was tending to his horses, whistling tunelessly as he worked. The normalcy of it seemed to mock the upheaval taking place inside the cabin. The coach leaves tomorrow morning, Eli said finally. You need to decide. Yes, Clara agreed, her voice heavy with exhaustion. I do. They spent the rest of the day in careful avoidance of each other, both trying to process the magnitude of what had changed in a single morning. Clara sat by the window with her father's letter, reading it again and again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less life-altering. Eli worked on the cabin with desperate intensity, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of saw and plane and hammer. But even as they struggled with their separate turmoil, both were acutely aware of the clock ticking toward morning. By sunset tomorrow, Clara would either be on her way back to a life of wealth and privilege in Boston, or she would have chosen to stay in Montana with a man who wasn't sure he could ask her to make such a sacrifice. The choice that had seemed so clear just hours ago, love over security, authenticity over convenience, now felt impossibly complicated. Frederick's death had changed everything, offering Clara a path back to the life she'd lost, while simultaneously forcing both her and Eli to confront the true depth of their commitment to each other. As night fell and they prepared for what might be their last evening together, neither knew what the morning would bring. The only certainty was that by the time Tom Fletcher's coach disappeared over the eastern hills, their future, whatever form it might take, would be decided. The night passed in restless fragments of sleep and wakeful anguish. Clara lay on her makeshift bed, staring at the ceiling beams Eli had hewn with such care, while across the cabin she could hear him shifting restlessly on his own bedroll. Neither spoke, but the silence between them pulsed with everything they weren't saying, all the words that might change everything or might change nothing at all. When the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the window openings, Clara finally abandoned any pretense of sleep. She rose quietly and stepped outside, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the crisp morning air. The mountains stood silhouetted against the brightening sky like ancient sentinels, unchanged by the human drama playing out in their shadow. Tom Fletcher was already up, checking his horses and preparing for the journey ahead. He glanced up as Clara approached, his weathered face kind but carefully neutral. "Morning, miss. Hope you got some rest." "Some," Clara lied. "Mr. Fletcher, may I ask you something?" "Course you can." Clara hesitated, then forged ahead. "You've been traveling these routes for years. You've seen people come and go, seen them make choices about staying or leaving. What do you tell someone who doesn't know which way to turn?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, running his hand along his lead horse's neck with the gentle touch of long familiarity. "Well now," he said finally, "I reckon the thing about choices is that you can't make them based on what other folks think you ought to want. Got to listen to what your own heart's telling you, even if it's whispering instead of shouting. And if your heart is telling you two different things, then maybe you ain't listening close enough. See, most times when folks think they're torn between two things, they're really torn between what they want and what they're afraid of wanting." Tom's eyes met hers with surprising directness. "Question is, which one are you going to let win?" Before Clara could respond, the cabin door opened and Eli emerged, already dressed for work despite the early hour. He moved with the controlled and precision of a man holding himself together through sheer will, his face carefully blank as he nodded to Tom and Clara. "Morning. Coffee's ready if you want some before you go." The slight stumble over the words revealed the cost of his composed exterior. Clara felt her heart crack at the pain he was trying so hard to hide. "Eli," she began, but he was already turning away. "I'll be working on the doorframe if you need anything. Still got a few hours of work before it's finished." Clara watched him walk toward the cabin with rigid purpose, and suddenly she understood what he was doing. He was completing the cabin, their cabin, even as he prepared to let her go. The door that would be the final piece of their shared home was being finished on the morning she might leave forever. Tom Fletcher cleared his throat diplomatically. "I'll get the horses hitched and ready. Take your time, miss. No need to rush these things." Clara nodded absently, her attention focused on the steady sounds of Eli's work. Each strike of his plane against wood seemed to echo with finality, the completion of something beautiful and the possible ending of something even more precious. She returned to the cabin to find Eli kneeling beside the doorframe, fitting the final piece with the same meticulous care he brought to everything he built. His movements were sure and practiced, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he kept his eyes focused on his work. "It's beautiful," Clara said softly. Eli's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. It's just a door. No, it's not. It's home. It's belonging. She searched for the right words. It's everything we've built together. Clara, don't. Eli's voice was rough with suppressed emotion. Please don't make this harder than it already is. Maybe it should be hard. Maybe the fact that it's hard means something. Eli sat back on his heels, finally looking at her directly. What do you want me to say? That I want you to stay? That I'm willing to watch you give up a fortune and a future for a broken-down cowboy and a cabin in the middle of nowhere? Yes, Clara said simply. That's exactly what I want you to say. Well, I can't. Eli stood abruptly, his composure cracking. I can't be that selfish. I can't ask you to sacrifice everything for me when you deserve so much more. What if what I deserve is the right to choose? What if what I deserve is you fighting for us instead of pushing me away? Before Eli could respond, voices outside interrupted them. Tom Fletcher was talking to someone, multiple someones from the sound of it. Clara and Eli exchanged glances, then moved to the window to see what was happening. A small group of riders had arrived, 3 men and a woman on horseback, all bearing the dust of hard travel. Clara recognized the woman immediately, Mrs. Henderson. From the neighboring homestead, her usually cheerful face creased with concern. The men were strangers, but their clothes and bearing marked them as townspeople rather than ranchers. Eli Rembrandt, one of the men called. We need to speak with you. Eli stepped outside, Clara close behind him. I'm Rembrandt. What can I do for you folks? The man who'd spoken dismounted and approached with the careful formality of someone delivering official business. He was middle-aged and well-dressed, with the soft hands of a clerk and nervous eyes that darted between Eli and Clara. My name is Walter Kemp, from the Territorial Land Office in Helena. This is Deputy Marshal Hawkins and Mr. Jameson from the bank. He gestured to his companions, then turned to Clara. And you must be Miss Whitmore. I am, Clara said, a cold feeling spreading through her stomach. Is there some problem? I'm afraid there might be, miss. We've received some disturbing reports about your situation here. Eli stepped slightly forward, his body language protective. What kind of reports? Deputy Marshal Hawkins spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of his office. Reports of an unmarried woman living in improper circumstances with a man not her husband. Reports suggesting that she may be here against her will or under false pretenses. That's ridiculous, Clara said sharply. I'm here by my own choice and our arrangements are perfectly proper. Are they? Mr. Jameson from the bank spoke for the first time, his tone suggesting he already doubted her words. Miss Whitmore, we understand you've recently come into a substantial inheritance. Your family is quite concerned about your welfare, particularly given your isolated circumstances. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Clara's parents, learning of Frederick's death and the inheritance, had somehow discovered her whereabouts and decided to intervene. The timing of the official visit, just hours before Tom Fletcher's scheduled departure, was too convenient to be coincidental. My family sent you, Clara said, her voice flat with understanding. Kemp nodded. Your father contacted the territorial governor directly. He's quite concerned that you may be the victim of fraud or coercion, particularly given the substantial sums involved in your inheritance. I see. Clara's voice was carefully controlled, but Eli could see the fury building behind her green eyes. And what exactly do you gentlemen propose to do about these concerns? Deputy Marshal Hawkins stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Well, miss, we're here to escort you safely back to civilization. Make sure you have proper legal representation when you claim your inheritance. And if I refuse to go? Well, now, Hawkins said slowly, I'd hate to think you were being influenced against your better judgment. Sometimes folks in these remote areas get confused about what's in their best interests. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Clara felt rage rise in her throat like bile, but before she could respond, Eli spoke up. The lady is free to make her own choices. he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "She's under no compulsion. Here, accept her own will. Is that so?" Jameson looked pointedly around the clearing, taking in the half-built cabin, the primitive conditions, the obvious disparity between Clara's refined appearance and her rough surroundings. "Forgive me, Mr. Rembrandt, but it's hard to believe any woman of breeding would choose this over a comfortable life in Boston. Maybe that says more about your imagination than it does about the lady's judgment," Eli replied, his voice dangerously calm. Hawkins' hand moved closer to his weapon. "Careful, friend. We're here on official business." Mrs. Henderson, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "Now hold on just a minute. I've known Eli Rembrandt for 3 years, and he's the most honest man in these parts. If Miss Whitmore says she's here by choice, then that's the truth of it." "Mrs. Henderson," Kemp said with patronizing patience, "I'm sure Mr. Rembrandt is a fine neighbor, but we're dealing with matters beyond local acquaintance. There are substantial legal and financial issues at stake. And what gives you the right to override a woman's own decisions about her life?" Clara demanded, her composure finally cracking. "I'm of legal age, sound mind, and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Are you?" Jameson pulled a folded document from his coat. "Because according to this psychiatric evaluation, commissioned by your family's physicians in Boston, your recent behavior suggests emotional instability, possibly requiring medical intervention." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. A psychiatric evaluation, the ultimate weapon in society's arsenal against inconvenient women. If such a document existed, if her family had gone so far as to question her sanity, then her choices had already been taken away. "That's impossible," she breathed. "I haven't seen a physician in Boston for months." "The evaluation was based on witness testimony about your behavior before leaving Boston, as well as your recent unconventional choices," Kemp explained with false sympathy. "Your family is naturally concerned about your mental state." Eli felt rage building in his chest like a furnace. He'd seen this before, the way powerful people used medicine and law to control those who threatened their interests. Clara's family wanted her inheritance under their influence, and they were willing to destroy her autonomy to get it. "You bastards," he said quietly, the words carrying more menace than a shout. "You're here to kidnap her. We're here to help." "A confused young woman," Hawkins replied, his hand now openly resting on his gun, "and I'd advise you not to interfere with official business." Clara looked around at the faces surrounding her, the official representatives of a world that had already betrayed her once, the neighbors who meant well but had no power to help, and Eli, whose love for her was written in every line of his tense body. The choice she'd agonized over all night had been taken from her, but in losing it, she'd found perfect clarity about what she truly wanted. "Mr. Kemp," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of her Boston education, "I assume you have some sort of official documentation requiring me to accompany you?" "We do," Kemp said, producing another paper. "A warrant for protective custody signed by Judge Morrison in Helena." "Judge Morrison," Clara repeated thoughtfully. "Any relation to Reverend Morrison of Boston?" The slight flush that crept up Kemp's neck told her everything she needed to know. The web of influence and corruption extended further than she'd imagined, connecting the man who destroyed her reputation to the officials now trying to control her future. "The judge's family connections are irrelevant," Hawkins said. "The warrant is legal and binding." Clara nodded slowly, then walked to where Tom Fletcher stood beside his coach, watching the proceedings with obvious discomfort. "Mr. Fletcher, I believe I'll be needing that ride to Sweetwater Creek after all." Eli felt something die inside his chest. Despite everything, the official pressure, the threats, the impossible odds, he'd hoped she might choose to stay. Now, watching her walk toward the coach with her shoulders straight and her head high, he realized that love sometimes meant letting go, even when it tore your heart apart. "Clara," he called softly. She turned back to him, and for a moment, the official, party and their machinations faded into irrelevance. It was just the two of them, standing in the clearing where they'd built something precious together. "The door," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's finished. The cabin's complete." Clara's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Then she climbed into Tom Fletcher's coach, her back straight and her face composed, leaving Eli standing beside the completed cabin that now felt like a monument to everything he'd lost. The horses strained forward, wheels began to turn, and Clara Whitmore disappeared from his life as suddenly as she'd entered it, taking his heart with her but leaving behind the echo of a love that had been real, however briefly it had lasted. The coach lurched forward with the grinding of wheels against stone and mud, carrying Clara away from the completed cabin that stood like an accusation in the morning light. Eli watched until the dust settled and the sound of horses faded into the mountain silence, then turned to face the official party that remained in his clearing like carrion birds after a kill. "Well," Deputy Marshal Hawkins said with satisfaction, holstering the authority he'd worn like a weapon. "That's settled then. Miss Whitmore will be properly cared for, and everyone can get back to their business." "Get off my land," Eli said quietly. "Now see here," Kemp began. "Get off my land." Eli's voice carried a note that made the banker step back involuntarily. "You got what you came for. You have no business here now." The officials mounted their horses with obvious haste, suddenly eager to be away from the broken man whose rage had taken on an almost tangible presence. Only Mrs. Henderson remained, her kind face creased with sympathy and something that might have been shame. "Eli," she said softly, "I'm sorry. If there was anything we could have done, there wasn't." Eli's voice was flat, empty of everything that had made it warm over the past weeks. They had their papers, their authority, they had everything they needed. She didn't want to go. That was plain enough to see. No, she didn't want to go. Eli looked at the cabin door that hung perfectly. In its frame, the final piece of a home that would now shelter only one. But sometimes what we want doesn't matter much against what other people decide for us. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment, studying Eli's face with the practiced eye of a woman who'd seen heartbreak in many forms. "What will you do now?" "Finish what I started, work the land, build what needs building." He shrugged, the gesture encompassing both resignation and stubborn determination. "Same as always." After Mrs. Henderson rode away, Eli stood alone in the clearing that still held the scent of horses and the echo of Clara's voice. The cabin behind him felt simultaneously complete and hollow, every board and beam a reminder of hands that had helped shape it, of laughter that had filled its spaces, of hope that had been cut down like wheat before the harvest. He walked to the door he'd finished that morning, running his fingers along the smooth wood that Clara had helped him sand. The cornerstone beneath his feet, the foundation stone he'd selected with such care, seemed to mock him now with its promise of permanence. What good was a foundation when the structure it supported was designed for two people and only one remained? But as the sun climbed higher and the normal sounds of the wilderness resumed around him, Eli found himself moving with purpose rather than aimless grief. There was still work to be done, still improvements to be made. The cabin might feel empty now, but it was solidly built, ready to weather whatever storms might come. He spent the morning installing the final hardware on the door, adjusting the hinges until they swung smooth and true. Each task was performed with the same meticulous care he'd always brought to his work, as if Clara might return at any moment to inspect his progress. Meanwhile, the coach carrying Clara bounced and swayed along the rutted road towards Sweetwater Creek, its passengers maintaining a tense silence. Clara sat rigidly upright, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in the mask of polite indifference she'd perfected during her years in Boston society. Tom Fletcher drove with his usual steady competence, but she could see the unhappiness. In the set of his shoulders, the official party rode alongside the coach, maintaining their vigilant escort with obvious self-importance. Deputy Marshal Hawkins occasionally glanced at Clara as if expecting her to attempt some desperate escape, while Kemp and Jameson discussed the legal technicalities of her situation in voices that carried clearly through the coach's thin walls. "The family's lawyers are meeting us in Denver," Jameson was saying. "From there, it's a simple matter of establishing proper guardianship until her mental state can be evaluated." "And if she resists?" Kemp asked. "The psychiatric evaluation provides all the authority we need. A woman who abandons a respectable life to live in primitive conditions with a stranger clearly requires medical supervision." Clara listened to their casual discussion of her future with growing fury. These men, who knew nothing about her life or her choices, were planning to strip away her autonomy based on the word of a family that valued control more than love. The irony wasn't lost on her. Frederick's inheritance, which should have given her unprecedented freedom, was instead being used to justify unprecedented control over her life. But as the miles passed and the cabin fell further behind them, Clara's anger began to crystallize into something harder and more focused. She thought about Eli, standing alone beside the door he'd finished for a home they'd never share. She thought about the weeks of honest work and genuine companionship they'd built together. She thought about the choice that had been stolen from her by people who believed they knew better than she did what her life should be. The coach hit a particularly deep rut, jolting all the passengers and causing Tom Fletcher to curse under his breath. As he fought to control the horses on the increasingly treacherous road, Clara made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Fletcher," she called through the driver's opening, "I need you to stop the coach." She took another step closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, close enough to touch if he dared. "But you," she continued, her voice softening, "you were the first person who ever asked me what I wanted. Not what I should want, not what would be practical or appropriate or beneficial to everyone else. You asked me what would make me happy." "Clara," Eli breathed, hardly daring to hope. "I want this," she said, gesturing around the clearing that held their cabin, their future, their choice. "I want you. I want the life we can build together with our own hands. I want to wake up every morning in a home we created, with a man who loves me for who I am, not what I can bring to a marriage." Eli reached for her then, his calloused hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "Are you sure? This won't be easy, Clara. Your family won't give up, and life here is hard even without that kind of pressure." "I'm sure," Clara said, covering his hands with hers. "Eli, I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about not being good enough for me. But you're wrong. You're not good enough for the woman my parents wanted me to be, or the wife Frederick expected to marry. You're something infinitely better. You're exactly right for the woman I actually am." When Eli kissed her, it was with the desperate relief of a man who'd thought he'd lost everything and found it returned to him beyond hope. Clara responded with equal fervor, pouring all her love and determination and newfound freedom into the connection between them. Tom Fletcher cleared his throat diplomatically. "Well now, I hate to interrupt, but we might have some practical matters to discuss. Those officials aren't going to give up easy, and they'll likely be back with reinforcements." Eli and Clara broke apart reluctantly, though Eli kept his arms around Clara as if she might disappear again if he let go. "What do you suggest?" Eli asked. "Marriage," Tom said bluntly. "Legal marriage, performed by someone with proper authority, with witnesses who can't be intimidated or bought. Once Miss Clara is legally Mrs. Rembrandt, her family's ability to control her gets considerably more complicated." Clara felt her heart skip at the casual way Tom had spoken her future name, Mrs. Rembrandt. It had a solid, honest sound that appealed to her far more than the elaborate titles her Boston life had promised. "There's a problem with that plan," she said reluctantly. Those officials mentioned that my family has commissioned a psychiatric evaluation, claiming I'm mentally incompetent. If that document has any legal weight, it might affect my ability to enter into a marriage contract. Not if the marriage happens before they can file their papers, Tom pointed out. Judge Patterson is in Sweetwater Creek right now, holding court. He's an honest man who won't be impressed by Boston lawyers or territorial officials with questionable warrants. Eli looked down at Clara, his brown eyes serious. Is that what you want? To marry me today, before we've had time to think it through? Properly? Clara laughed, the sound bright with joy and certainty. Eli, I've been thinking it through for weeks. Every day we worked together, every evening we talked by the fire, every moment we learned to trust each other. That was me thinking it through. The only thing I need to decide is whether I have the courage to claim the happiness I've found. And do you? Ask me, Clara said softly. Eli's throat worked as emotions he'd never expected to feel threatened to overwhelm him. He'd spent so many years believing he wasn't worthy of love, wasn't the kind of man a woman would choose freely. Now Clara stood before him, having literally fought for the right to be here, asking him to claim the future they could build together. Clara Whitmore, he said, his voice rough with feeling, will you marry me? Will you share this life I'm building? Help me make it into something beautiful and lasting. Will you be my wife, my partner, my heart? Yes, Clara said without hesitation. Yes to all of it. Yes to the life we'll build. Yes to the love we've found. Yes to being brave enough to choose happiness over security. Tom Fletcher grinned and climbed back onto his driver's seat. Well then, I reckon we'd better get to Sweetwater Creek before those officials decide to come back with more friends. Judge Patterson holds evening court when necessary, and I suspect he'll consider this necessary. As they prepared to leave for town, this time together, this time by choice, Clara looked back at the completed cabin one more time. The door Eli had finished that morning hung perfect and true in its frame, ready to welcome them home as husband and wife. The cornerstone, she said suddenly, pointing to the foundation stone Eli had chosen with such care. That's what we are, isn't it? The foundation everything else is built on. Eli followed her gaze to the stone that had been one of his first acts of faith in this place, this future. Yes, he said, understanding flooding through him, strong enough to support whatever. We build on top of it. Then let's go build something beautiful, Clara said, taking his hand and stepping up into the coach that would carry them toward their wedding, their future, their choice to love each other despite every force arrayed against them. As Tom Fletcher urged his horses forward and the cabin fell behind them in the gathering dusk, neither Eli nor Clara looked back. They were too busy looking ahead, toward the life they would create together. One choice, one day, one act of courage at a time, the soon official party might return with reinforcements. Clara's family might send lawyers and doctors and every weapon of wealth and influence at their disposal. But they would face whatever came as husband and wife, partners in the truest sense, united by love that had been tested by separation and proven stronger than fear. In the coach, Clara's hand found the love letter Eli had originally written but never sent, the words that had brought them together despite his intention to keep them apart. She smoothed the pages carefully, thinking of how that unsent declaration of hope had become the foundation of their shared reality. "What are you thinking about?" Eli asked, watching her tend to the letter with such care. "I'm thinking," Clara said, looking up at him with eyes bright with tears of joy, "that sometimes the most important letters are the ones we're afraid to send, and sometimes the best decisions are the ones we're terrified to make." Outside the coach, Montana territory, spread out in all directions, vast and challenging and beautiful. It was a land that demanded courage from those who would make their lives there, and Clara and Eli had found that courage in each other, the strength to build something lasting in a place where only the strongest love could survive. 6 months later, The cabin in the valley had transformed from a symbol of solitary hope into the heart of a thriving homestead. The wedding quilt that now graced the bed Eli had built with his own hands told the story of their union in patches of fabric donated by every woman in 3 counties, a gift from a community that had come to respect the couple who'd chosen love over convention. Clara stood in the doorway of their home, watching Eli work with a group of neighbors to raise the frame of a new barn. The men moved with the practiced efficiency of frontier cooperation, each understanding his role in the collective effort. Their voices carried across the clear autumn air, punctuated by the ring of hammers and the creak of seasoned timber settling into place. "Mrs. Rembrandt," called Sarah Henderson, approaching with a basket covered by a checkered cloth, "I brought some of that apple butter you liked so well." Clara smiled at the name that still sent a warm thrill through her every time she heard it, Mrs. Rembrandt, a title earned through love rather than social expectation, representing a partnership built on mutual respect and shared labor. "Thank you, Sarah. The men will appreciate it with their lunch." Clara accepted the basket gratefully, inhaling the sweet scent of apples and cinnamon that spoke of harvest abundance and neighborly kindness. "Can't do that, miss," Tom replied, though his voice held regret. "Got my orders to get you to Sweetwater Creek." "Your orders came from men who have no legal authority over me," Clara said, her voice carrying the crisp certainty of someone who'd found her backbone. "I'm not a prisoner, Mr. Fletcher. I'm a passenger who's changed her mind about her destination." Deputy Marshal Hawkins spurred his horse closer to the coach. "Miss Whitmore, you're under protective custody. Any attempt to—" "I'm under illegal detention," Clara interrupted, her years of education finally serving her well. "That warrant you showed me was signed by a judge in Helena for protective custody in cases of mental incompetence. But I haven't been examined by any physician, haven't been declared incompetent by any court, and haven't been given the opportunity to defend myself against these accusations." She leaned forward, her green eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Furthermore, gentlemen, I happen to know that territorial law requires such evaluations to be conducted by licensed physicians with no family or financial connections to the parties involved. Since Reverend Morrison, who provided the witness testimony for my evaluation, is Judge Morrison's brother, the entire proceeding is legally invalid." The men exchanged uncertain glances. Clara's legal knowledge was clearly more extensive than they'd anticipated, and her composed delivery suggested a mind far from the emotional instability described in their documents. "Now," Clara continued, "Mr. Fletcher is going to stop this. Coach and I'm going to get out. You gentlemen are welcome to continue to Denver and explain to my family's lawyers how you lost custody of a woman who was never legally in your custody to begin with." "You can't just—" Kemp began. "I can and I will." Clara's voice carried the authority of someone who'd found her power and intended to use it. "Unless you plan to physically restrain a free citizen of the United States, in which case I'll be filing kidnapping charges against all of you." Tom Fletcher had been listening to this exchange with growing admiration. Whatever else might be said about Miss Whitmore, she clearly had more spine than her fancy clothes suggested. When she called for him to stop the coach, he found himself pulling on the reins almost before he'd consciously decided to do so. "Tom!" Hawkins barked. "You keep moving." "Can't do that, Marshal," Tom said with the careful politeness of a man who'd dealt with authority all his life. "Lady says she wants out, and I ain't in the business of forcing passengers to travel against their will. Bad for business." The coach rolled to a stop beside a grove of aspen trees, their golden leaves catching the afternoon light like coins, scattered on green felt. Clara stepped down before anyone could assist her, her traveling boots finding solid purchase on the rocky ground. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher," she said with genuine warmth. "I'll make sure you're compensated for any trouble this causes." "No trouble, miss," Tom replied with a grin that suggested he was enjoying the official's discomfort more than he cared to admit. Been wanting to see somebody stand up to these bureaucrats for years. Deputy Marshal Hawkins dismounted and approached. Clara with his hand on his weapon. "Miss Whitmore, I'm ordering you to get back in that coach. And I'm declining your order, Marshal Hawkins." Clara stood her ground with remarkable composure for someone facing an armed lawman. "You have no legal authority to compel me, and we both know it." For a tense moment, the two faced each other in the dappled sunlight beneath the aspens. Then Tom Fletcher cleared his throat diplomatically. "Marshal," he said, "might I suggest you wire Helena for clarification before you do something will? All regret? Miss Whitmore here seems to know her law pretty well, and I'd hate to see you end up on the wrong side of a federal court." Hawkins hesitated, clearly recognizing the wisdom in Tom's suggestion, but reluctant to back down after making such a show of authority. Finally, he stepped back with obvious frustration. "This isn't over, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Your family won't give up easily." "I'm counting on it," Clara replied coolly. "I'm looking forward to the legal challenge. It should be quite illuminating to see how far they're willing to go." As the official party continued towards Sweetwater Creek, defeated but not entirely convinced they'd seen the last of this situation, Clara found herself alone on the mountain road with Tom Fletcher and a decision that felt like the first, truly, free choice she'd made in years. "So," Tom said conversationally, "where exactly do you want to go, miss?" Clara looked back along the road they'd traveled, toward the valley where a completed cabin stood empty, and a man she loved was probably wondering if he'd ever see her again. "Home," she said simply. "I want to go home." The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the clearing when Tom Fletcher's coach came rolling back into view, dust clouds marking its approach like smoke signals of hope. Eli looked up from the fence post he'd been setting, work that was necessary, but felt hollow without Clara's laughter to fill the spaces between hammer blows. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The coach had left that morning, carrying Clara away from him forever. There was no reason for it to return, no logical explanation for the familiar sound of wheels and harnesses approaching his homestead. But as the coach drew closer, Eli could see Tom Fletcher's weathered face, split by an enormous grin, and beside him on the driver's seat, impossible, wonderful, real, sat Clara Whitmore, her auburn hair catching the light like fire, and her green eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart hammer against his ribs. The coach rolled to a stop in the same spot it had occupied that morning, but everything had changed. Clara climbed down before the wheels stopped turning, her movements quick and decisive, nothing like the resigned dignity with which she'd departed hours earlier. "Clara?" Eli's voice came out rough with disbelief. "What? How are you here?" "It seems," Clara said, walking toward him with a smile that lit up her entire face, "that kidnapping is still illegal in Montana Territory, regardless of how respectable the kidnappers might be." Tom Fletcher chuckled as he climbed down from the driver's seat. "Miss Clara here gave those officials a lesson in territorial law they won't soon forget. Should have seen their faces when she told them their warrant wasn't worth the paper it was printed on." Eli felt hope rising in his chest like a physical thing, warm and dangerous, and almost too much to believe. "You mean you chose to come back?" "I chose to fight," Clara said, stopping just an arm's length away from him. "For the first time in my life, I chose to fight for what I want, instead of accepting what other people think I should have. But the inheritance, your family's lawyers, will have to deal with me on my terms, not theirs." Clara's voice carried a confidence Eli had never heard before, the sound of someone who discovered her own power. "Eli, I've spent my entire life letting other people make decisions for me. My parents chose my education, my social circle, my expectations for the future. Frederick chose when to court me and when to abandon me. Those officials this morning chose to treat me like a piece of property to be moved around at will. The past months had not been without their challenges. Clara's family had indeed sent lawyers, as Tom Fletcher had predicted, armed with documents and legal arguments designed to challenge both her mental competence and the validity of her marriage. But Judge Patterson had proven as incorruptible as Tom had promised, ruling that a woman who could present such cogent legal arguments in her own defense was clearly of sound mind, regardless of what Boston physicians might claim from a distance. The inheritance remained tied up in legal proceedings, but Clara found she cared less about Frederick's money with each passing day. She and Eli had built something far more valuable than financial security. They'd created a life of purpose and contentment that no amount of wealth could purchase. Clara's teaching skills had found new purpose in their remote valley. She now instructed the children of neighboring homesteads in a one-room schoolhouse that Eli had built just down the valley, using lumber from trees they'd felled together. Her students might be fewer in number than those at Miss Pemberton's academy, but their eagerness to learn and their appreciation for education that came at the cost of real sacrifice made every lesson a joy. "Teaching suits you," Eli had observed. One evening, as Clara graded compositions by lamplight, her face glowing with satisfaction at her students' progress. "This teaching suits me," Clara had corrected. "Teaching children who understand that knowledge is a tool for building better lives, not just a social accomplishment." Eli's carpentry business had flourished as well, his reputation for honest work and fair dealing spreading throughout the territory. The wooden plane that had belonged to his father now had a place of honor in the workshop Eli had built behind their cabin, and Clara often watched him work with the same tool that had shaped his childhood, carrying forward traditions of craftsmanship and integrity. Their domestic rhythms had evolved into something deeper than mere accommodation. They were true partners in every sense, each contributing unique strengths to their shared enterprise. Clara's organizational skills and education complemented Eli's practical knowledge and building expertise. When winter storms trapped them for days at a time, they spent the hours reading together, planning improvements for the spring, or working on projects that would enhance their comfort and efficiency. "Look there," Eli called from where he was guiding a massive beam into position. Perfect fit. Clara followed his gaze to see the barn's ridgepole settling into place with the precision that marked all of Eli's work. Like their marriage, it was built to last. Every joint carefully planned and executed to withstand whatever weather might come. As the afternoon wore on and the barn's frame took shape, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened, disgraced teacher who'd stepped off Tom Fletcher's coach 6 months ago bore little resemblance to the confident woman she'd become. Living on the frontier had stripped away the artificial constraints of her former life, revealing strengths she'd never known she possessed. "Clara," Mrs. Henderson called from the kitchen garden they'd planted together, "come see how well your tomatoes are doing." Clara walked over to admire the plants that had grown from seeds she'd ordered from a catalogue, another small victory in her campaign to bring beauty and abundance to their mountain valley. The tomatoes hung heavy and red on their vines, promising a rich harvest that would see them through the winter months. "You've got quite the green thumb," Mrs. Henderson observed. "These are the finest tomatoes I've seen this side of Denver." "Eli says it's because I talk to them," Clara laughed. "I tell them about Boston, about the students I used to teach, about all the places they'll never see. I think they grow out of curiosity." As evening approached and the workday wound down, the neighbors gathered around the table Eli had built in their front yard, sharing the meal Clara had prepared with contributions from several of the women. This too had become a cherished ritual, the way frontier families supported each other through shared labor and communal celebration. Tom Fletcher had arrived for the barn raising, as he did for most significant events in the valley, bringing news from the outside world and his own particular brand of practical wisdom. Tonight, he regaled the group with stories of his recent travels, including an encounter with the officials who tried to force Clara's return to Boston. "Ran into that Deputy Marshal Hawkins in Helena last month," Tom said with obvious relish. "Asked me if I'd seen anything of you folks lately. Told him you were doing fine, building quite a reputation as solid citizens." "Did he say anything about my family's legal efforts?" Clara asked, though with less anxiety than such news would once have caused. "Seems their lawyers are having a hard time finding grounds to challenge a marriage that's clearly working out." "So well," Tom replied. "Hard to argue a woman's been coerced when she's obviously thriving." Eli reached for Clara's hand across the table, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "They're welcome to visit any time," he said mildly. "See for themselves how we're getting along." As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky and the neighbors began their journeys home, Clara and Eli found themselves alone with their completed barn and their growing sense of accomplishment. They walked hand in hand around their property, checking on the animals and securing everything for the night. "Are you happy?" Eli asked as they paused beside the creek that provided their water and powered the small mill wheel he'd installed. "Happier than I knew it was possible to be," Clara replied without hesitation. "Are you? Every day with you feels like a gift I didn't know I deserved," Eli said simply. They stood together in the gathering darkness, listening to the water's gentle murmur and the distant call of an owl hunting in the pine woods. Above them, the same stars that had watched over their first awkward encounters now witnessed their deep contentment and mutual love. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that letter had never been sent?" Clara asked. "Sometimes," Eli admitted, "but then I think maybe it would have found another way to reach you. Maybe we were always meant to find each other, one way or another." Clara considered this, thinking of all the chances and choices that had brought them together, the bureaucratic mix-up that had sent her letter, the blizzard that had trapped them in proximity, the courage they'd both found to fight for their love when others tried to tear it apart. "I think you're right," she said finally. "I think some things are strong enough to overcome any obstacle, patient enough to wait for the right moment, true enough to survive any test." As they walked back toward their cabin, Clara caught sight of their wedding quilt hanging on the line where she'd put it to air that morning. The patches caught the moonlight like a map of their community, scraps of fabric from dresses worn to church socials, curtains that had brightened humble windows, aprons that had protected good clothes during hard work. Each piece carried the story of a woman who'd contributed to their happiness, creating something beautiful from the fragments of daily life. "Look," Clara said, pointing to the quilt. "Even in the dark, it's beautiful." "Like everything we've built together," Eli replied, opening the door to their home, the cabin that had started as his solitary refuge and become their shared sanctuary. Inside, the rooms glowed with the warm light of oil lamps and the lingering heat from the day's cooking. Every surface bore the mark of their joint efforts. The bookshelf, where Clara's volumes sat beside Eli's practical manuals. The kitchen, where her recipes mingled with his frontier wisdom. The bedroom, where their love had grown from tentative attraction to deep, abiding partnership. As they prepared for sleep in the home they'd completed together, Clara reflected on how profoundly her definition of wealth had changed. Frederick's inheritance still sat in legal limbo, but she'd found riches beyond anything money could purchase. She had meaningful work that challenged and fulfilled her, a community that valued her contributions, and most importantly, a love that had proven itself stronger than convention, distance, or the combined forces of social disapproval. "Clara," Eli said softly as they settled into bed beneath the wedding quilt that symbolized their community's blessing, "do you have any regrets?" Clara considered the question seriously, thinking of the life she'd left behind, the securities she'd abandoned, the expectations she'd defied. Then she looked at her husband's face in the lamplight, weathered by honest work, marked by old sorrows, but bright with present contentment, and knew her answer. "Only one," she said, surprising him. "I regret that it took a scandal and a broken engagement, and a journey halfway across the continent for me to find the courage to choose my own happiness. I regret all the years I spent living other people's version of my life instead of discovering what would truly make me content. Eli was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. And now I wake up every morning knowing that this life, this love, this choice to build something beautiful with our own hands, this is exactly where I belong. Clara smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek. Now I know that sometimes the most important construction project isn't a cabin or a barn, but the patient work of building a love strong enough to last a lifetime. Outside their window, the completed cabin stood solid against the mountain wind, its foundation stone as firm as the day Eli had set it in place. Inside, two people who'd found their way to each other against all odds settled into sleep with the deep contentment of those who'd built something beautiful and true. The poor cowboy had indeed built a cabin with his bare hands, log by patient, log, joint by careful joint. But what he'd built with Clara's help was far more than shelter from the elements. It was a home that proved love could overcome any obstacle, hope could survive any trial, and two hearts willing to work together could create something stronger than either could build alone.